Well, thank you all for coming. I guess I should introduce Hub a little before introducing the report. Promoting small schools. So we are an organisation that comes from a definite standpoint. We are in favour of small schools. Now, worldwide there are lots of organisations that do this, and most of them would be classed as pressure groups. And Hub really wanted to go in a slightly different direction. If we really believe that small schools are valuable in the community, we should not be afraid of impartial research. We should be interested in not making point scoring, which we've seen so much of in the last few weeks, but we should be interested in actually getting facts. And so this is the way that Hub has seen itself. We are a research organisation. However, we have a problem there. If Hub itself produces research, certainly at this stage, before we have any really national presence, we just come out from nowhere and say, we are a research organisation and we have done this research and we promote small schools. No one is going to believe us because, after all, they know where we're coming. So we decided that the only way that we could actually proceed was to go to outside consultants, independent outside consultants, ask them questions, and then leave them to come up with the answers. So what I'm promoting here is not a Hub report, except in the sense that Hub, with help from people like Unlimited, have funded it. This is a report prepared by independent consultants, Cambridge consultants, and we asked them to look specifically at the cost of small primary schools, because this was the most active question that we felt that we should be addressing. And so we went to them and said, right, here is the question, here, and we had done some spade work. We found out things like the existence of the Stats Wales website and so forth. So we were able to cut down the amount of time that they had to spend on looking for primary data. But giving them the primary data, pointing them in the direction, was the most we did. After that we said, right, you prepare the report. And basically, this is the fundamental question. And you might ask, actually, should we be asking this question at all? The official policy of the Welsh Assembly on education actually says nothing about saving money. What it says is that we want the best possible education for our children. And I hope we would all agree that that is the primary question. That is the most important question. And perhaps then, we ought not to be asking the question, does closing a small school save money? We should be asking the question, which I would say we should be asking, does closing a small school act in a way which is detrimental to the educational interests of the children involved? But we all know there is the subtext. The subtext that is going on all the time. I'm a resident of Acwss. We know very well that in Acwss, one of the driving forces is that Acwss has to save money. And however much they would deny it, the people who are making the decisions are influenced all the time by the question whether by closing the school they are going to save money. So we felt that this was a question that had to be addressed, and we had to try and find out what the facts were. And what we came up with was the single most important finding of the review is that there's almost a complete lack of research on the topic. Whenever you read somewhere saying, somebody says, we can't afford to have these small primary schools, or perhaps even more lethally, giving money to small primary schools takes money away from the children in the large schools, the children who are being unrepresented and ignored. We have to realise that when we get independent consultants in to look at this sort of thing, they say there's actually almost no evidence, no hard evidence, whether this is true or not. So, well, our researcher did take things a little bit further. So, although we would say decisions are being taken without the primary evidence, there is some primary evidence, and we have to go and look at it. I'm going to say Does closing small schools save money? Probably not. I'm not going to say not. I'm not going to say definitely not. We don't have the evidence. And the evidence, when we have it, I'm sure will show that in some cases closing a school will save money. In some cases it won't. This is not a simple question by any means. But here are some simple statistics. Now this is, I suppose, the key illustration in the report. And so let me take you through it a little. These axis here shows the number of children in a school. Each point on here represents a primary school in Wales. And I have to admit that we've dropped off a little bit up here. There are a few schools which have more than 600 odd children. However, we go down to 0 here, and this is the cost per pupil. So that's 2,000, 4,000, 6,000, and so forth. And I might say that another illustration in the report shows the similar curve for England, and it is remarkably similar. So, although there are all sorts of queries about the data that goes into this, we do feel that statistically there's a lot of data here, a lot of schools, that we can validly apply statistics to this and look at it. And one thing we see, of course, is there's a lot of scatter, enormous amount of scatter. Some small schools do a lot better than some large schools. The situation is not simple. There is, however, a very definite trend, a very, very slow increase in costs as you go to smaller and smaller schools. And then, round about the point you get to about 40 children in the school, the costs do start to escalate quite dramatically. Now, one thing I should say about this picture is that there have been some schools excluded. We excluded all the schools that were specialising in children with special needs. There are a number of schools around the country which are specialised in that, and their costs are astronomical. They would be up there in the sort of 15, 16, 17,000 pounds per child. What we don't know about these statistics is how many special needs children there are in individual schools and how those will skew the costs. So there's a great number of things that we don't know about this graph. But the general trend is clear, that there is a small increase down to about 40 children, and then the costs per child start to go up quite rapidly. So, going back to the question we're asking, does closing a small school save money? It looks as though that graph at least is saying, yes it does. For very small schools, it saves money dramatically. So why are we even arguing the case against closing small schools? Well, there's one thing that's skewed in that graph, and that is the fact that those small schools which are costing so much per pupil don't actually have very many pupils. And so if we look at things on an overall statistic for Wales as a whole, we have to say that closing all those very, very small schools is not going to save you a great deal of money, even if that budgetary fact that we had underpinning that is the only thing that matters. Because closing those schools is not going to save you very much, because there's only a small number of children involved. And in fact, if we take a really draconian view, let's say that the costs do start to increase slightly but perceptibly once you get below about 90 pupils. So let's close all the schools in Wales that have got fewer than 90 pupils. You're going to have a big fight on your hands to do that. You're going to have uproar throughout the Principality. But let's say you could do it, and let's say that you could transfer all the children involved to larger schools, and they would then cost only what the average for children in those larger schools cost. The total saving on the Welsh education budget would be 2%. All that trouble, all that fighting, all those upset parents, all that disruption, all those children with their education disrupted because they're moving from school to school, but 2% on the education budget. It doesn't look as though there's very much to be gained actually by closing small schools as an overall policy. I'm not standing here to claim that there should be no school closures. Some schools clearly should be closed, but it's not a simple question, and don't think that by closing small schools you're going to save much money. And therefore, if you're thinking of closing a school, go for, is it an educational benefit? Now, of course, there are other things that will happen if you close a small school. The small schools are not, you know, we look around Cardiff, there are not a lot of small schools. I think there's only one primary school in the whole of the Cardiff educational area, which could be classed as a small school. The small schools are scattered out in the rural communities, and they are scattered. And if you close a small school, you're going to have to get the children from where they're currently going to school to where they are now going to go to school. And that is not going to be cheap. How much it would cost you is one of the big blocks that we came up against, or our researcher came up against in doing this research. She found evidence from other places, evidence from Scotland, where in fact the average cost to a council of every pupil they transport is about £1,500. She was able to find some statistics of Wales. Now, I don't want to push these too hard. They are very poor statistics. They are all sorts of caveats which you will find in the report. And the report you will find is full of caveats, full of exceptions, full of, well, we can't be sure of this. But if those estimates in that right-hand column are anywhere near correct, and if closing a small school means that suddenly a council will have to incur those costs, any money that is saved by closing that school is going to be eaten up in transport costs. So we have to be very, very careful about taking the line that we would save money by closing the school. We could close a small school in one area and find at the end of the day that we are actually spending several £100 per pupil more than we did once the small school was active. So our conclusion at the end is, and I hope we can all agree on this, education authorities should follow the guidance. Education authorities should close schools if they need closing, not to save money, but to improve the education of the children who are involved. And that is our conclusion, and I don't think that further research would actually alter that position, but it might alter some of the other perceptions. And so, what we fondly hope is we will be able to take this research forward. And you will find in the report that our researcher makes a number of proposals and a number of things. Says more research is needed. This is based on actual school costs, actual transport costs. We need that research. And we need research into case studies because there are vast differences in the cost of schools. There is in the report an interesting comparison between two local education authorities which should have pretty much the same cost, have in fact pretty much the same cost for their larger primary schools. But when you get down to the small primary schools, one education authority is costing several £100 per pupil more than the other education authority. Why is that? We don't know. Nobody knows. And I might say, from my own personal point of view, one of the astonishing things in the report was the statement that says that these statistics from Stats Wales have to be taken with a pinch of salt because different authorities report their findings to Stats Wales in different ways. And I think, what are the politicians doing? They've got this vast resource of very clever people in Stats Wales, and they're not insisting that the people who provide them with the information are providing in a standard form so that we can do statistically valid analysis. And that, I think, is one message for the politicians I would take from this. For goodness sake, get your statistics sorted so that we can actually draw valid conclusions from them. And having made that plea, I think I better shut up. So here we are. And we would be very happy, I'm sure, to answer any questions.
Well done. Thank you, John. answer after all to do. I think it raises some very important questions, and as you said,